thanks for coming, everyone. So just to introduce the topic a little bit, in the world of open source companies, there's always a lot of talk about risks, managing the risks from having an open source project, which license should you choose in order to manage the risks and ensure that you're protected from a big hyperscaler taking your project, hosting it, and then making lots of money off it. All these things about risk management. And so I wanted to do the talk. In fact, I like to change the topic of conversation around open source companies to focus more on what are the advantages of being an open source company. Because if there are no advantages, quite honestly, why are you doing it? And I fundamentally believe that there are advantages to being an open source company, and we need to talk about them so that if you are an open source company, you take advantage of those advantages. And while also managing the risks, because let's not be dishonest with ourselves. There are also risks involved with building an open source company. Okay, so this is me. I already was introduced a little bit. I run a conference called Open Source Founders Summit that is for founders and leadership in open source companies that meet the definition that I just gave. Companies for whom the open source project that they are built around is critical to their success. I'm also a consultant for positioning and product strategy for open source companies. If you are or know of an open source company that needs help with their positioning or with figuring out the difference in value proposition between their project and their product, that's what I do. Put them in touch with me, and I host a podcast called The Business of Open Source. So there you go. That's me. Before we start about what's different about open source companies, let's talk about how companies win, just in general. In general, companies win when they're able to build a great product, tell people that that product exists, that's called marketing, get people to pay them money for that product, that's called sales. And then the last thing, business operations, isn't going to give you a competitive advantage necessarily, but it can screw your company. So also companies that manage to effectively hire and fire people, manage their accounting, etc. So these are sort of the 4 things you have to get right if you're going to win as a company. There are ways that open source can help actually with all of these things, even that last one. The last one, like managing your accounting, I haven't yet figured out how open source can help you, but there are a lot of advantages related to hiring, specifically when it comes to having an open source company. So this is how companies win. How can open source companies do all of those things better? And particularly, I want to talk about product, marketing, and sales because they are an open source company. And that is what we're going to talk about. Okay, so people do not like to admit this. However, your open source project, very fundamentally, if you're an open source company, is marketing. In almost all scenarios, it is marketing. If you can accept that, recognize that that does not make you evil, and really lean into it, it can give you a huge competitive advantage over your competitors. So I have quotes here. A lot of these lessons I've pulled from interviews on my podcast. And these are quotes from founders of open source companies. Joe Duffy in particular talked about how he thought about the open source project from Pulumi in the similar way as he thought about VS Code at Microsoft, and he used to work at Microsoft, which is to say your open source project is a loss leader. You don't make money on it, but it allows you to make money on other stuff. So this is a marketing funnel, a basic marketing funnel, but what I really like about it is that it doesn't stop at conversion. Oh, my little pointy thing doesn't work. It doesn't stop at conversion. So a lot of people think of marketing and they think of awareness, consideration, then it's the salesperson's problem. And then people pay you money and they're out of the marketing funnel. We don't talk about them anymore. That's actually not a super great way to think about a marketing funnel. Instead, you think about Awareness. People used to not know that you existed. Now they do. Consideration. You're in the running for a potential deal. Conversion. Oh, they've just paid you money. That is not the end of the story. Because ideally, you want people to continue paying you money. You want them to renew your contract. You want the contract to grow. You want more people in the organization to use your product. And then even better, you want your customers to tell other people about your company, about your project, and about your product. So having an open source project, if you are a software company, because we are talking about software companies, can help people discover that your company, that your project exists. I want to make a caveat. One of the mistakes that some open source companies make is not making enough of a connection between their project and their company, and their project and their product. So you could be a user of the project and not know that the company exists. This happens remarkably often. But if you do it right and you don't do that, you don't hide the fact that there's a company behind it, having an open source project and an open source community can help people discover that your project exists. It allows people to get a taste for what it's like using your product, using something that your company makes without having to pay you anything. It builds trust because they're able to see what's happening in your code, what your code looks like. Does it look like it's well done or not? Does your software do what it says it's going to do and not do the things that it says it's not going to do? So it's going to build trust, which in turn generally helps with conversion because the people you are selling to, regardless of the size of the company, they are human, and human beings like to do business with people that they trust. And so you'll end up converting more people as an open source company if you're doing things right. But then it's especially after that conversion that open source companies can really have an advantage, both when it comes to loyalty, so allowing people to feel a real sense of ownership. It's really interesting. So GitLab instantly has a program to get customers to contribute to the open source project. And they found that this dramatically enhances loyalty because the customers end up feeling a really intense sense of ownership in the progress of GitLab. Even when they're already paying money to get a commercial relationship with them, they still will also dedicate engineering hours to make the product better. And that's something you only get if you're an open source company. And the same goes for advocacy. So one of the things that open source projects generally have going for them is getting people to have this sense of ownership around the project, which makes it that much more likely that your customers will end up going to a conference and talking about your project or your company or your product, but just your project, and becoming your advocates. They're not even free. They're actually paying you, and they're helping you with your marketing. Amazing. Okay, so a second thing is to build a dual flywheel. So what does that mean? Dual flywheel means that as your revenue increases, your users increase too. As your users increase, your revenue increases too. So this is an idea from GitLab, and it really involves getting alignment from your product marketing and sales organizations. But when you do this right, you can really get both dramatic increases in adoption and in revenue that happen at the same time. Again, it's not always obvious to get the dual flywheel to work, but if you're able to do this, you'll get advantages over your competitors. So do a land grab. One of the advantages of an open source project is that it allows you to get massive adoption. And if one of your goals is to change your space, to get massive adoption, starting with an open source project is the way to go. You will almost always get a much larger percentage, or a much much wider adoption if you have an open source project than if you don't. Again, it's not always obvious to translate that into commercial success, but you have an advantage. Really listen to your users. And this is the advantage that open source projects generally have. They have way more users, so much larger pool of people to get feedback from. And open source users are often more open to giving feedback than paid customers. Paying customers, what do you want? The paying customers just want to give you money and they want a thing that works. It's a transactional relationship. Open source communities, that's not the way that they work. There's the idea that part of the deal of using an open source project is that you become at least a tiny bit invested. If somebody asks for your feedback, you give it to them. There's also, processes that are built into open source projects that request feedback. What sort of issues are people opening? Are people making any contributions? Are there any pull requests? If you really listen to what your users are saying, it can give you really enormous and really valuable clues for what sort of product you should build, for what people actually want to pay for and what they want to pay you for, what they see as your special advantage in the ecosystem that you work in. Build trust. So when you're able to allow people to verify that you do what you say you do and you don't do what you say you don't do, this is incredibly valuable when it comes to building trust, especially in the world of software where there's a lot of customers that are going to be jaded. They're going to worry, this is another software that's going to take my private data and use it in a way that I don't feel comfortable with, but there's no way for me to verify because it's completely proprietary. So there can be other ways that you build trust too. This is a quote from Brian Fox of Sonatype. When potential customers can see you acting in the ecosystem in a way that they think is respectable and competent, again, this builds an enormous amount of trust that you don't have if you just have a plain proprietary software. This is especially valuable at the beginning, too. Once you are a company that's established, you've been around for 10 years, 50% of the Fortune 100 are on your customer list, people trust you. But when you don't have any of that, building that trust and showing that this software is serious and it does what it says it will do, and you are serious people who are competent, that having an open source project can be incredibly valuable, and it can open doors for you that otherwise would stay closed. Next, you need to build a product that does not compete with your project. And this goes back again to really listening to your customers. So it turns out building a product that people are willing to pay you for is super hard. And that's because people don't like to pay for stuff. And actually anticipating what your market really finds valuable can be challenging. When you have an open source project that is giving you access to a huge pool of people in your target market, if you are able to leverage that, you're much more likely to be able to find the thing that you should build that people are actually willing to pay you for. We're almost done, and we'll go to questions. Here's a quick wrap-up of what you should do if you want to leverage open source, not just to survive, not just to not lose, but to win. First of all, you want to use open source as a distribution model to accelerate every stage of your marketing funnel. You want to use open source as a development model to build better products. By better products, by the way, I mean products that better meet the needs of your users. It does not necessarily mean products that are more interesting to build or that are technically superior. No, products that better meet the needs of your target market. You should take your community's trust extremely seriously and also use your community as a force multiplier. Find ways to have your community do your marketing for you, basically. And then you need to make sure that there's enough differentiation in your ecosystem's mind and in your own mind and your teams between what is open source and what's in your commercial offering, and what the difference is that people are getting out of your commercial product versus your open source product, your open source project. One last thing that I wanted to bring up, I actually, in an earlier version of this talk, had a number of quotes from one of the founders of Min.io, and I took them out. But it's worth being slightly cynical about this. If really, really all you want to do is make a lot of money, let's face it, you can also use your open source project to get tons of adoption, and then you can change your license and force people to pay you. Let's not say that that's a great idea, but it is a strategy that obviously some people use, and it's worth acknowledging. If really all you want to do is build that huge software company, it can make sense to take that route. So there we go. We end on a cynical note. This is the end. But if we have questions, now's your opportunity.
Thanks, Emily. That was awesome. Questions?
Do you have any advice specifically for companies that are working in the open source space, but mostly with public sector customers rather than private commercial entities?
So do I have any specific advice for working with public sector customers? There's a lot of public sector customers that are legally required to use open source solutions. That's something to be aware of. So you're automatically you wouldn't even be in the game if you weren't an open source, if there wasn't an open source option as part of your offering. And the second thing is just selling to governments, selling to the public sector is different than selling to private companies. And assuming, if that's your market, you know how that works. And you just have to know that that's a different game to play by. On the other hand, the same things about if you get in by people who work in the organization, discovering your open source project, they can still go to their supervisors and advocate for you. I know of public sector organizations that technically have to go through a huge procurement process in order to make any sort of contracting, basically in order to buy anything. But because they found an open source company that exactly meets their needs, and they stumbled on it because it's open source, and they already know that this is the best option for them, they can find workarounds. So what I'm saying here is that even if there's this really cumbersome procurement process, when a customer is really motivated to become a customer, they will usually find a way.
Coming back to the Min.io example, if you start a company based on open source software and then you just rug pull and sort of run away from your community, is that actually, well, we've seen examples where it works, but in fact the community can also take ownership of whatever was there before the rug pull and go on by themselves, right?
Yes. So when you have an open source company, if your plan from the very beginning is to pull the rug on your community, I would say that's a risky plan. From what I've seen happen, I actually don't think that that's the plan from the beginning when there is a license change. I think in almost every case, what happens is that there's, I almost want to say like a failure. Like the company tries to make their revenue targets without changing the license, and then has trouble doing so, and then decides, well, let's see what happens if we change the license. I don't actually think that very many. I don't want to say that nobody has ever thought of this as a strategy from the beginning, but my feeling about this is that it's always, or nearly always, that there's pressure to increase the growth rate, and it seems like the best way to do that is changing the license.
It's often a money problem, right?
It's a money problem. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's always a money problem. So yeah, and there's a risk. There's a risk to both. There's a risk to changing the license as well. There's a risk to changing the license because there are also advantages to being an open source company. Yes.
So it occurs to me that the bulk of your talk is centered almost on open core, more so than open source per se. And I was wondering if you could spare a few words about the decision to pursue open core as opposed to models where there is an overlap, a complete overlap between your commercial offering and your open source offering, that they're not distinct.
So if there is complete overlap and there is no difference in value between what a user gets and what a customer gets, nobody will ever pay you, period. That means there's a difference in value. So what do people pay you for?
To host the server for them.
That is a value. There is not complete overlap in that case.
But all of the software is open source. It's not open core.
So if you host something, and it means I'm able to use your software without hosting it myself, that's a value proposition in and of itself. The fact that yes, I could host that software myself because all of the software is completely free and open source, that doesn't really change the fact that perhaps I would rather not host it myself, or perhaps I can't, or perhaps I would rather have you host it because you're the expert. There's a peace of mind. So there always is going to be a difference in value proposition. Even if all you sell is support for your open source project, there's a difference in value proposition. The value proposition is when something goes wrong, you have somebody to call. If you don't pay me and something goes wrong, yes, you can open an issue, but maybe I'll get around to it when I get around to it. If you pay me for support, I will give you my cell phone number, and if you have a problem and it's 3 a.m., I will answer my phone and I will fix your problem immediately. That is a huge value proposition. So being aware that there's a difference, there's never complete overlap. Otherwise, why would somebody pay you? So I actually don't think of this talk as being purely about open core. Specifically, when you think about the product. So open core, usually when we think of open core, you have your open source project, and then you have a enterprise version, and the enterprise version comes with a dashboard and SSO and some security, some like authentication, and what else? Maybe some like team management functionality, a fancy UI, and that's it. But sometimes you can have a situation where you have your project, you have another product, and they fundamentally give you a different outcome. So an example might be a company. I actually haven't checked in on them recently, but a company called what are they called? They have make a project called Threat Striker, I think. But anyway, so their open source project identifies threats. Their product remediates threats. Fundamentally different things. It's not, so is it an open core or not? But obviously they're related. So if you are an open source user, you are more likely, there's a clear relationship between the commercial product, but it's not really open core.
Okay, so a question from below. Do you think there is an agenda when companies provide open source software, for example, messaging software, and they provide the software as is and leave usability features like a GUI or a good GUI, which is usable and intuitive, just to be paid, and the rather free part of the software or the free version lacks a lot of features and yeah, isn't usable at all. Do you think this is on purpose?
Honestly, I'm kind of a cynic. Everyone has an agenda. Every human being has an agenda. Every company has an agenda. Let's be honest about that. If you have an open source project that isn't usable as on its own, that really doesn't have value as an open source project on its own, to me, you're not an open source company. That's a fake open source company. If your open source project doesn't provide value on its own, at least to like a slice of the market, right? Because not everybody is going to have the skills to self-host it, et cetera. So for me, that's the bottom line. Like, and in fact, all of these things that I've talked about as the advantages of being an open source company, I don't think you really get them if your open source project is crippleware, as they call.
Okay, then that's it. Thank you, Emily.
All right. Thank you, everyone.